April 27th, 1943, Oran, Algeria. The desert air shimmered with heat as captured men of the Afrika Korps were herded toward rows of olive-green tents. Each German clutched his mess tin, expecting watery soup or a handful of dry bread. When the Americans handed them small cardboard boxes labeled K-Ration, U.S. Army, laughter rippled through the ranks. Dog food, one of them scoffed in perfect English. For their spoiled soldiers, not real fighters. Oberfeldwebel Hans Krüger, a 26-year-old mechanic from Bremen, turned the box over in his hands. Inside lay biscuits, a tin of cheese, chocolate, instant coffee, cigarettes neatly packed, individually sealed. He frowned. It was organized. Too organized. They tore into it anyway, mocking the taste at first. Then silence. The biscuits were crisp, the cheese is rich, the real chocolate melted on their tongues. Even the coffee was fragrant. A corporal muttered, "This is better than our rations in Africa." Another added quietly, "Better than home." Krüger chewed in disbelief. The box that looked like a toy meal held 3,200 calories more than a German soldier received in 3 days by the end of the North Africa campaign. He stared at the American sergeant collecting the empty tins. The man smiled politely, offered another box, and walked away. No arrogance, no hatred, just efficiency. In that moment, Krüger realized something his commanders never had. This enemy fought wars with abundance, and the Germans had never prepared for that. Just 2 weeks before Krüger held that K-Ration box, the proud banners of the Afrika Korps had fallen. On May 13th, 1943, the last German formations in Tunisia, nearly 250,000 soldiers surrendered to the Allies. It was the largest German capitulation since Stalingrad, a collapse so vast that Berlin tried to hide it from its own citizens. For months, Nazi propaganda had promised that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was merely regrouping, that supply shortages were temporary, that American forces were clumsy amateurs. The leaflets claimed, "Americans can build cars, not fight wars." The men who marched into captivity still believed that, even as Allied trucks roared past, carrying food, cigarettes, and fresh uniforms. On the barren docks of Oran, tens of thousands of German and Italian prisoners waited for transport ships, their uniforms hung loose from hunger. Their rations, black bread, ersatz coffee, and a few ounces of tinned meat barely totaled 1,200 calories per day. Yet the Americans processed them with assembly line precision. Each man was photographed, tagged, medically examined, vaccinated, and handed an English-language pamphlet titled, "Your Rights as a Prisoner of War." It was printed on smooth white paper, the kind Germany no longer had. Among the prisoners, disbelief spread like rumor. "They feed us well," someone whispered, "to make us weak later." Another replied, "No, they feed us because they can." From above the camp fences, they watched endless convoys of jeeps and trucks bringing more crates, food, soap, cigarettes not for soldiers, but for prisoners. To men raised under years of rationing, it felt like mockery, yet behind that abundance was something more dangerous than any weapon proof that America could supply not just its own armies, but its enemies, without strain. And as the first Liberty ships prepared to carry them across the Atlantic, one thought began to unsettle the prisoners more than defeat itself. If this is how America treats captives, what kind of power must it hold for its own men? The smell hit them first, not the stench of boiled turnips or rancid fat they knew from Africa, but the scent of roasted meat and baked bread drifting from the American mess tents. The prisoners lined up silently, helmets in hand, eyes darting. Each expected humiliation watery soup, scraps tossed like bait. Instead, the American cooks handed out trays, stacked with food, white bread still warm from ovens, thick slices of beef, mashed potatoes, vegetables, coffee, and even dessert, apple pie. Oberfeldwebel Hans Krüger stared at the plate, confused. The soldier serving him a cheerful Texan with flour on his sleeve simply said, "Eat up, soldier. Soldier, not a prisoner." They sat on wooden benches, still hesitant to eat. Then one took a bite. Silence spread, followed by murmurs of disbelief. "Real coffee," whispered one. "Real butter," another. For months they had fought for mouldy bread and canned horse meat. Now they tasted flavor again. Krüger wrote that night in his diary, "The Americans give us meat twice a day, fresh vegetables, sugar, real milk. It cannot be real. Perhaps they want us to talk, or perhaps they simply have too much." Nearby, a medic from Dusseldorf did the math. Each meal averaged over 3,000 calories. He compared it to the Afrika Korps ration, 900 calories at best. It was not generosity, it was power made edible. When the guards collected leftovers, the shock deepened. Entire plates went untouched. "Why throw it away?" a German asked, horrified. The guard shrugged. "We got plenty more." Plenty. That word echoed through the tents long after lights out. For the first time since capture, the prisoners began to whisper less about escape and more about the scale of what they had seen. If American prisoners in Germany received half this treatment, their nation would already be starving. Krüger closed his diary that night with a line that summed up the quiet collapse of certainty. "We were taught that America was soft, but only a nation overflowing with strength could afford such kindness." The next morning, long columns of prisoners stood beneath the blazing Algerian sun, awaiting transport. But what awaited them was no chaos, it was choreography. American soldiers moved with clockwork precision. Trucks rolled in, one after another, engines purring in unison. Each man was logged, numbered, tagged, and seated according to pre-written lists. The Germans, who had once prided themselves on order, now watched an enemy outmatch them at their own game. A corporal muttered, "They move like a machine." His comrade corrected him quietly. "No, they built the machine." At the harbour, the prisoners froze. Row after row of towering cargo ships gleamed in the sun. Liberty ships, the Americans called them. Each one could carry thousands of men or tons of cargo, and new ones were being launched every few days. The docks were alive with motion cranes swung, forklifts roared, stevedores shouted instructions. To the prisoners, it was less a harbour than an assembly line stretching to the horizon. One ship, they learned, had been built in 4 days. They laughed, then realized no one was joking. Oberfeldwebel Hans Krüger wrote in disbelief, "In Africa, we waited months for supplies that never came. Here, their ships seem to multiply overnight. The Americans build them as if they were toys." Before boarding, each man received fresh water, soap, blankets, and another K-Ration box. Guards checked names against lists written in perfect German. No confusion, no shouting, just calm, relentless order. When the convoy finally departed, 20 ships in perfect formation, the German prisoners stood at the rails in silence. The sea was calm, but it was the machinery around them that unsettled them most. Even the waste was organized. Kitchen scraps were sorted. Trash was compacted. Meals arrived by the clock. The Germans had called themselves the engineers of Europe, yet here was a nation treating logistics like an art form. One officer whispered, "If they can manage prisoners like this, how do they manage their armies?" The thought spread faster than fear. The Third Reich had built its myth on discipline and control, and yet, aboard those liberty ships, the Germans began to realize that America had perfected both, without tyranny. The Atlantic wind bit cold across the deck, but inside the medical bay of the Liberty ship, SS Robert Peary, warmth and cleanliness reigned. White sheets, metal instruments gleaming under electric lamps. The faint scent of antiseptic instead of blood. For the German prisoners, it was a disorienting sight. Back in Africa, the field hospitals had been mud and flies, nurses exhausted, morphine rare. Here, even prisoners received treatment under sterile light. Oberarzt Dr. Heinrich Bauer, a Wehrmacht surgeon captured near Tunis, stood frozen as an American medic waved him closer. "Doctor, you can assist if you like," the man said and handed him a fresh pair of gloves. Bauer hesitated. "Doctor." The word carried respect, not suspicion. He expected interrogation or disdain, but instead found professionalism. The patient was another German, a young man with shrapnel in his leg. American and German hands worked side by side in silence. The instruments were new, precise. The bandages are soft cotton, not reused gauze. Then came the real shock, a small vial labelled penicillin. Bauer had only heard rumours of it, the miracle drug said to cure infections thought fatal. He watched as an American nurse prepared the syringe and injected it into the patient's arm casually, as if it were routine. In Germany, Bauer later wrote, we still amputate when infection sets in. Here, they cure it with a drop of liquid. We fight nature, they command it. When the operation ended, the American officer shook his hand. Good work, doctor. No ranks, no superiority. Just acknowledgement between professionals. Elsewhere, minor cases of colds, cuts, fevers were treated with the same care. The medics logged every name, every dosage, every recovery. Prisoners too weak to stand were carried to infirmaries, fed soup, and wrapped in blankets marked U.S. Army. One German sergeant whispered as he sipped warm broth. They treat us better than our own medics ever did. Another replied, perhaps they can afford to. Doctor. Bauer spent that night awake in his bunk, the hum of the ship's engine steady beneath him. He realized he had seen something far more devastating than superior weapons. He had seen superior mercy. And in that mercy, the myth of German moral superiority began to die. The train that carried the prisoners deeper into America glided through a landscape of open fields and small towns, glittering with electric light. Inside, silence hung thick, broken only by the rhythmic click of rails. But the silence wasn't from fear anymore. It was from confusion. At every station stop, American Red Cross nurses boarded briefly, handing out coffee and sandwiches to German prisoners. One even smiled and said, "Welcome to Texas." A few prisoners muttered curses under their breath, unable to process it. Others simply stared, too bewildered to speak. When the train finally stopped at Camp Herne, the Germans expected barking guards, rifle butts, and shouted orders. Instead, a polite American officer greeted them in flawless German. "Gentlemen, you are now guests of the United States under the Geneva Convention. You will be treated according to international law. Cooperation will ensure comfort for all." Guests. The word landed harder than any weapon. The guards who escorted them didn't shove or insult. They offered directions, even helped carry luggage. One soldier apologized when a bag fell into the dust. To men who had seen Soviet brutality, it felt unreal. In the camp hospital, Dr. Heinrich Bauer, the same surgeon from the Liberty ship, found a new kind of shock. American doctors invited him to join their ward rounds. They discussed patients like equals. They debated treatments, compared notes, even laughed together. "Dr. Bauer," one said, "I hear you worked under Erich Lexer? His methods were ahead of their time." Bauer nodded slowly, unable to believe they knew his mentor's name. In Germany, the regime had declared Anglo-American medicine decadent, corrupt, unscientific. Yet here were Americans quoting German medical journals from before the war, respectfully. That evening, an American officer entered the mess hall where German doctors and officers Saturday. He raised a cup of coffee. "To peace someday, gentlemen, and until then to professionalism." Some raised their cups hesitantly. Others stared into the dark brew, unsure if this was kindness or clever psychological warfare. Oberleutnant Krüger wrote later, "They defeated us with engines and bombs. Now they are defeating us with dignity." It was the first time many Germans began to question not just who was winning the war but who truly deserved to. The first full morning at Camp Herne began with a whistle not from guards but from the kitchen. The air smelled of coffee, real coffee. Rows of German prisoners stood in line, expecting the usual thin soup and black bread of army life. But when they stepped into the mess hall, everything they thought they knew about war collapsed. Stainless steel counters gleamed. The floors were clean. American cooks, smiling, unhurried, ladled out scrambled eggs, bacon, buttered toast, and oatmeal. Each tray carried a K-Ration equivalent of over 3,000 calories, the same diet American soldiers ate on the front. And there was more: milk, sugar, and small packets of powdered lemonade. Oberfeldwebel Hans Müller, a veteran of Tobruk, could only stare. "We fought half a continent for bread," he whispered, "and here they feed prisoners like generals." At every table sat men frozen between hunger and guilt. Forks clinked in silence, the sound of disbelief. When lunch came, the disbelief turned to something else: unease. Meat again, potatoes, dessert. The waste alone was staggering. Uneaten bread was thrown into bins. Coffee left half-finished. In Germany, families had starved. Here, even prisoners were overfed. An American sergeant noticed their hesitation. "Eat up," he said with a grin. "Uncle Sam's got plenty more." Later, trucks rolled in carrying ice blocks for the camp's refrigeration units. Others delivered crates of Coca-Cola bottles, distributed evenly among the barracks. When prisoners asked if this was a trick for propaganda, the guards just shrugged. Standard delivery. Everyone gets it. That night, in the barracks, men compared notes: how many eggs, how much sugar, how much meat. None could calculate it. They'd spent years measuring rations in grams. Here, abundance had no measure. Oberleutnant Krüger wrote in his journal, "They fight with steel and bombs, but they conquer with bread." And deep inside, a terrifying thought began to grow. Perhaps America's greatest weapon wasn't its army at all. It was its limitless supply of everything. By late summer, groups of prisoners were assigned to labor details beyond the camp fences. What they saw in those weeks would demolish every last illusion of the Third Reich's superiority. At first, it began with a short ride through the countryside, then the horizon changed. Factories, dozens of them, smokestacks rising like forests of iron, conveyor belts clattering through open windows. Everywhere, motion is constant, confident, endless. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Radke, a machinist from Bremen, stared through the truck's window as they passed a textile mill in Houston. "That's bigger than our entire district," he whispered. His guard replied casually, "That's just one of them." Inside the factory gates, the shock deepened. Women, thousands of them, worked the machines with precision and speed. Teenagers hauled crates. Even black workers operated complex equipment, earning the same wages as others. In Germany, this sight would have been impossible. Here, it was normal. A foreman noticed Radke's stare and said, "We build faster than we fight." Every machine glowed under fluorescent light, powered not by coal or muscle but by electricity, endless, cheap, invisible. It had been inside their minds. Winter came to Texas early that year. Frost dusted the fields around Camp Hearn, and for the first time since their capture, the German prisoners felt cold that wasn't born of fear. Inside the barracks, the stoves burned steady, fueled by American coal. Prisoners received extra blankets, gloves, and wool coats stamped U.S. Army. It was more than many had ever owned at home. On Christmas Eve, 1943, something happened that no one could have imagined. The camp loudspeakers, usually reserved for orders, played soft music Silent Night, the same carol sung across Europe. Then came a message, spoken in German: "Tonight, you are far from home. But you are not forgotten." Moments later, the gates opened not for escape, but for generosity. Local church groups arrived, carrying boxes wrapped in brown paper, cookies, candy, cigarettes, and knitted scarves. Every prisoner received one. Obergefreiter Hans Müller held his package like a relic. Inside was a card written by a child. "Dear German soldier, I hope you come home safe. Merry Christmas." He stared at the handwriting for a long time. He had bombed British convoys, watched comrades burn in desert sands, yet here, his enemy's children wished him peace. Dr. Heinrich Bauer, now working in the camp hospital, witnessed something even more startling. When a prisoner collapsed from pneumonia, an American nurse sat by his bedside through the night, holding his hand as he slipped in and out of fever. When the man recovered, she smiled and said, "You're too stubborn to die before peace comes." It wasn't a pity, Bauer later wrote. It was to respect the kind we never showed our enemies. Snow began to fall the next morning, rare and fleeting in Texas. Dozens of Germans stood silently in the yard, watching the flakes settle on the barbed wire. One man whispered, "If they can show mercy to us, maybe we were wrong about everything." That day, no guards shouted, no prisoners argued. The camp was quite peaceful, as if, for a single day, the war had ended inside the fences, and for many, it truly had. By the spring of 1944, the Germans at Camp Herne were no longer just prisoners, they were students. The American command, facing a growing number of captured officers and educated men, began a quiet experiment: re-education through exposure. It didn't start with lectures or leaflets, it began with libraries. Rows of books appeared in the recreation hall. Shakespeare, Jefferson, Lincoln, Goethe, even German classics banned under the Reich. The sign above the shelves simply read, "Free reading, no censorship." At first, the prisoners were suspicious. Oberleutnant Hans Krüger refused to open an American book, saying, "They will poison our minds." But curiosity proved stronger than fear. Within weeks, men gathered around the tables, reading about democracy, science, and history. They found ideas they had been forbidden to think about. Then came the classes. American officers, many fluent in German, invited prisoners to discussions on economics, agriculture, and government. They spoke not like conquerors, but like teachers. "Ask anything," one instructor said. "We are not here to convert you, only to explain." Doctor? Heinrich Bauer taught medicine to fellow POWs using American textbooks. "Their hospitals," he said, "are built on teamwork, not obedience. Their science serves people, not power." The transformation spread quietly. Men who once swore oaths to Hitler now debated the meaning of freedom. They studied the US Constitution, amazed at its simplicity and power. One prisoner remarked, "In Germany, the law serves the ruler. Here, the ruler serves the law." Newspapers printed inside the camp began to reflect this awakening. What started as nationalist rants turned into reasoned discussions about rebuilding Germany without tyranny. Even guards noticed the change. The arrogance was fading, replaced by thoughtfulness. Letters home began with strange new phrases. "The Americans are not what we were told. They live differently, perhaps better." Obergefreiter Müller wrote, "We thought America's strength came from machines. Now I see it comes from minds that are free." By summer, over 40,000 German POWs across America were enrolled in education programs. Some learned English, others studied civics, agriculture, or trade skills. What began as captivity was becoming something else, a classroom for the reconstruction of Germany's conscience. Winter 1944, the Texas wind cut through the camp's barbed wire, carrying the smell of pine and smoke. Christmas lights shimmered faintly across the barracks, electric, warm, unnecessary. Inside the infirmary, Oberleutnant Walter Müller, once a proud officer of the Afrika Korps, sat beside the bed of an American guard wounded in a tractor accident. Müller had volunteered to help the doctors not out of duty, but something quieter, harder to name. He held the man's wrist, checked his pulse, and whispered, "You shouldn't be this kind to us." The guard smiled weakly. "You're a man, same as me. That's enough." That night, Müller returned to his bunk and stared at the wooden ceiling. In Germany, he had been taught that compassion was weakness, that the enemy was subhuman. But here, he had seen American doctors give penicillin to prisoners before treating themselves. He had seen guards share cigarettes and farmers invite POWs for Christmas dinners. He opened his diary, his handwriting trembling. "They feed us like friends. They call us Sir. I am treated with more dignity here than in my own country." The words frightened him not because they were untrue, but because they were undeniable. Around the same time, hundreds of miles away at Camp Swift, another prisoner, Feldwebel Otto Lang, broke down during an English class. The instructor had written one word on the chalkboard: freedom. Lang stood up, his voice cracking. "We never understood this. We thought freedom was chaos, but maybe that is the reason they are strong." The room went silent. Several prisoners nodded. The guard at the back, barely 20 years old, swallowed hard. Something in the air had shifted the quiet realization that they were witnessing not propaganda but a moral system that worked. Letters from that winter changed tone completely. Gone was the disbelief replaced by gratitude. "They conquered us with food, not bullets," one wrote. By the time spring arrived, the camps were no longer prisons in spirit. They had become sanctuaries for men rebuilding their sense of worth, one act of kindness at a time. And in the heart of Texas, beneath an alien sky, the sons of the Reich learned the most painful and beautiful lesson of all. Humanity was stronger than ideology. By spring 1944, the prisoners had seen enough to realize America's true weapon wasn't the atom bomb it was producing. Every number they heard struck harder than artillery. Every statistic was a revelation. Every factory, a sermon in steel. At Camp Hearn, a visiting officer from Washington addressed the prisoners with cold precision. "The United States has built 296,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and 2.4 million trucks since 1941. A murmur rippled through the room. Some laughed in disbelief. Others simply stared. The Germans had been told that America was decadent, lazy, industrially fragile. But now they learned that a single plant in Detroit Ford's Willow Run produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. 18 hours a day, 3 shifts, 7 days a week. At the shipyards in California, the Kaiser Company launched a Liberty ship every 4 days, a steel city that could cross oceans before the paint was dry. Germany could not build one in a month. In Pittsburgh, U.S. Steel poured 10,000 tons of metal daily, enough to build 2 battleships every week. The American auto industry, converted for war, built more engines in a month than the Luftwaffe received in a year. The prisoners listened to these figures in silence. It wasn't arrogance, it was awe. How could a democracy organize such power? How could a nation so free, so chaotic in theory, become the most disciplined machine in history? One POW, Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, wrote, "They have achieved total war without totalitarianism. Their efficiency is voluntary. Their obedience comes from belief." He was right. The statistics weren't propaganda, they were physics. America was a perpetual motion machine fueled by freedom and confidence. Every loaf of bread, every ration of milk, every gallon of gasoline that reached the front came from this vast engine. And even after feeding armies, America had more than Germany, more than Britain, more than the rest of the world combined. Back in Europe, Germany was rubble. But out of that rubble, a new generation rose: engineers, farmers, teachers, and thinkers shaped not by fascist lies but by the truth they had seen in captivity. They remembered the hot meals, the fairness of guards, the sight of American abundance. Many of them carried those lessons into Reconstruction. Former prisoners became industrial planners, city administrators, even diplomats. The same men who once swore allegiance to Hitler now drafted the foundations of a democratic West Germany. Historians would later call them the accidental students of democracy. Krüger's letters from 1950 capture that quiet revolution. We learned that strength without compassion is brutality. We learned that abundance without justice is greed. And we learned that freedom, when shared, multiplies. In 1985, Krüger returned to Texas. The same guard who once watched him in the camp was there, older but smiling. They embraced not as enemies, but as old soldiers who had survived history's most brutal lesson. The barbed wire was gone. The war was long over. But the transformation that remained forever. They had come to America in chains, bound by orders, by ideology, by a belief in superiority. But what they found wasn't vengeance, it was proof. Proof that strength could be merciful and power could be generous. Behind every fence post, every steaming kitchen, every handshake between enemies, the illusion of Nazi supremacy shattered. The German soldiers who once believed they fought for a perfect Reich discovered something far more powerful, an imperfect democracy that still fed its prisoners better than its conquerors. They returned home with more than memories. They carried a revelation. That freedom, when organized by decency, could outproduce tyranny, that compassion, backed by confidence, could rebuild the world faster than any army could destroy it. Across the Atlantic, a new Germany would rise, one built not from conquest, but from what those POWs had seen with their own eyes, the lights of small-town America glowing through the train windows, the taste of hot coffee and white bread, the sound of laughter between men who should have been enemies. That was the true victory not won on the battlefield, but in the quiet triumph of human dignity. America didn't just defeat Nazism, it converted it through abundance, fairness, and the unshakable faith that kindness could be stronger than hate. The story you've just heard isn't about war. It's about what comes after war when the guns go silent, but the lessons remain. And if you believe stories like this should never fade into the shadows of history, if you believe humanity's greatest strength is not destruction, but creation, then subscribe. Because every week, we uncover another hidden chapter of World War II, not just how it was fought, but how it survived. One story at a time, one truth at a time, until the last light of history is seen again.